The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble steps of the Metropolitan Courthouse as Sarah Chen stood at its entrance, her designer briefcase feeling unusually heavy in her hand. At 34, she had already made partner at one of the city's most prestigious law firms, but today she wasn't thinking about her achievements. Her mind was focused on the homeless woman she had witnessed being mistreated in this very courthouse just a week ago. Sarah's perfectly tailored suit and meticulously styled hair painted a picture of success, but her eyes kept drifting to the homeless people gathered in the small park across the street. For the past 3 months, she had been secretly gathering data on how the local justice system treated the homeless population. What she had discovered disturbed her deeply. In her office on the 23rd floor of the Preston and Chen Law Building, Sarah closed her laptop and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city stretched out below her, a maze of gleaming skyscrapers and busy streets. But her attention was drawn to the small figures she could see huddled in alleyways and on benches. "Ms. Chen, your 2 o'clock appointment is here," her assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "Cancel all my appointments for the next month, Rachel," Sarah replied, her voice firm. "And please don't ask why." Rachel's confusion was evident in her hesitation, but she didn't question her boss's instruction. Sarah had earned that kind of trust over the years. Opening her bottom drawer, Sarah pulled out a worn notebook filled with handwritten notes. For weeks, she had been interviewing homeless individuals who had appeared in court, documenting their stories of humiliation and unfair treatment. One name appeared repeatedly in their accounts: Judge William Harrison. Sarah had observed Judge Harrison's courtroom several times. His treatment of homeless defendants was nothing short of cruel. He would mock their appearance, make assumptions about drug use without evidence, and hand down unnecessarily harsh sentences for minor infractions like panhandling or sleeping in public spaces. That evening, after most of her colleagues had left, Sarah stayed behind to finalize her plan. She opened a small duffel bag containing carefully selected items: worn clothes from a thrift store, an old blanket, and supplies to alter her appearance. Her heart raced as she realized what she was about to do. Sarah knew that going undercover was risky. If discovered, she could face serious consequences, possibly even disbarment. But conventional methods hadn't worked. Formal complaints against Judge Harrison had been dismissed, and the local bar association seemed uninterested in investigating. In her apartment that night, Sarah stood before her bathroom mirror, practicing the story she had crafted. "My name is Marie Smith," she rehearsed, deliberately slouching her shoulders and softening her usually confident voice. "I lost my job 6 months ago, couldn't pay rent." The words felt strange in her mouth, but she knew they needed to be convincing. She spent hours studying videos of how people's mannerisms changed after long periods on the streets. She noticed the way they avoided direct eye contact, how they hunched their shoulders as if carrying an invisible weight, the slight tremor in their hands from constant exposure to the elements. Sarah called her younger sister, Lisa, the only person she trusted with her plan. "I need you to monitor my apartment and handle any emergencies that might come up," she explained. "If anyone asks, I'm on a meditation retreat in Arizona. No phones, no internet." "Are you sure about this, Sarah?" Lisa's concern was evident. "This seems dangerous." "Someone has to expose what's happening," Sarah replied, her determination evident in her voice. "These people are being treated like they're not even human." The next morning, Sarah Chen disappeared. She withdrew cash from her account, turned off her phone, and left her credit cards at home. In a public restroom near the city's outskirts, she transformed herself into Marie Smith. She smudged her face with a mixture of dirt and makeup, messed up her hair, and changed into the worn clothes. Looking at her reflection in the scratched mirror, Sarah barely recognized herself. Gone was the confident attorney who commanded respect in any room she entered. In her place stood a woman who looked like she had been beaten down by life, exactly the kind of person Judge Harrison loved to ridicule. As she stepped out into the street, Sarah felt a mix of fear and determination. She had given herself 3 weeks to gather enough evidence to expose Judge Harrison's misconduct. What she didn't know was that these 3 weeks would change not only her life, but the entire justice system in her city. The first night on the streets hit Sarah harder than she had expected. Despite her thorough research and preparation, nothing could have truly prepared her for the bone-deep chill that crept through her thin blanket as she huddled in a relatively safe corner of Central Park. The other homeless people eyed her suspiciously at first. She was too clean, too new to the streets. An elderly woman named Grace, her face weathered by years of outdoor living, was the first to approach her. "First time on the streets, honey?" Grace asked, settling down beside Sarah with a plastic bag containing all her possessions. Sarah nodded, remembering to keep her eyes downcast as she had practiced. "Lost my job, then my apartment," she mumbled, sticking to her prepared story. Grace's rough laugh surprised her. "Well, you picked a decent spot, but you'll freeze here at night. Come on, I know somewhere better." Following Grace, Sarah learned her first real lesson about street life. The homeless community had its own structure, its own rules, and its own way of looking out for each other. Grace led her to a small group sheltering in the doorway of an abandoned building, where the walls blocked the worst of the wind. Over the next few days, Sarah's transformation from attorney to homeless woman became more than just physical. Her carefully applied dirt became real grime. Her practiced shuffle turned into a genuine response to aching feet and cold muscles. The hunger in her eyes was no longer an act. The few dollars she got from panhandling barely bought enough food to quiet her stomach. She kept a small notebook hidden in her clothes, writing in it late at night when no one was watching. Her observations were no longer just about Judge Harrison's courtroom. They were about survival, about the invisible rules that govern life on the streets, about the way people's eyes slid past her as if she didn't exist. "You got to be more aggressive with the panhandling," Grace advised her on the 5th day, watching Sarah's tentative attempts to ask for money. "But be careful. The cops around here, they're looking for any excuse to bring us in." Sarah learned quickly. She discovered which coffee shops would let her use their bathroom if she went in early morning before the rush. She found out which dumpsters behind restaurants might have edible food, and which ones to avoid. The local shelter's schedule became as familiar to her as her old court calendar had been. One morning, while searching for aluminum cans to sell, Sarah encountered a young man named Tom. He had been a software engineer before a mental health crisis cost him his job and home. His story was exactly the kind of evidence she needed, but as she listened to him talk, she realized she was no longer just gathering information for her case. She genuinely cared about these people and their stories. "The worst part isn't the cold or the hunger," Tom told her, his eyes distant. "It's how people treat you, like you're not even human anymore." Sarah's notebook filled with stories. A woman who lost everything to medical bills, a veteran struggling with PTSD, a teenager who fled an abusive home. Each one had faced Judge Harrison's courtroom, and each one had stories of humiliation and harsh sentences for minor infractions. 2 weeks into her undercover life, Sarah caught her reflection in a store window and barely recognized herself. Her face was thinner, her eyes harder. The expensive haircut she'd maintained for years was now a matted mess. Even her posture had changed. She had unconsciously adopted the protective slouch of someone used to being ignored or avoided. Grace noticed the changes too. "You're learning," she said one evening as they shared a half-eaten sandwich someone had thrown away. "But you're different from most newcomers. You watch everything, right in that little book of yours. What's your real story, honey?" Sarah felt a pang of guilt at deceiving these people who had taken her in, taught her to survive. But she reminded herself of her mission. The evidence she was gathering could help not just her new friends, but countless others who would face Judge Harrison's contempt. On her 17th day on the streets, Sarah saw her opportunity. The police were doing one of their regular sweeps, targeting homeless people for petty violations. As they approached her corner, she made sure to be visible, holding out her cup for change. She knew what would happen next. She would be arrested, and finally face Judge Harrison herself. What the judge didn't know was that this seemingly helpless homeless woman was about to turn his world upside down. The police cruiser's lights flashed against the darkening sky as 2 officers approached Sarah's corner. She had deliberately positioned herself near the busy shopping district, knowing this area had strict anti-panhandling laws. Her heart pounded, but not from fear. After nearly 3 weeks on the streets, this was the moment she had been waiting for. "Ma'am, you know panhandling isn't allowed here," the younger officer said, his hand resting casually on his belt. "We've had complaints from the store owners." Sarah hunched her shoulders, playing her role perfectly. "Please, I'm just trying to get enough for some food," she mumbled, keeping her voice rough from weeks of sleeping in the cold. Grace, watching from across the street, called out, "Leave her alone." She ain't hurting nobody. But the older officer was already pulling out his handcuffs. Stand up, ma'am. You've been warned about this before. The officer's tone was tired, routine, as if this was just another day of sweeping unwanted people off the streets. Sarah allowed herself to be handcuffed, noting how the officers didn't bother to ask if the cup of coins and crumpled bills was her property. They simply emptied it into an evidence bag. Every detail would be important later. The back of the police car smelled of cleaning solution, barely masking other, less pleasant odors. Sarah caught glimpses of familiar streets through the window, streets she used to walk confidently in designer heels, now seeing them from a completely different perspective. At the precinct, the booking process was exactly as her homeless friends had described it. The board desk sergeant barely looked at her as he took her fingerprints. Sarah gave her practice story. Marie Smith, no fixed address. She knew her real fingerprints wouldn't raise any flags. She had carefully created a temporary false record for Marie Smith weeks ago, using her legal connections. The holding cell was crowded with other homeless people caught in the same sweep. Sarah recognized several faces from the streets. A young woman was crying quietly in the corner, while an elderly man muttered to himself on the metal bench. "First time in the tank?" asked a familiar voice. It was Tom, the former software engineer, who had been picked up for sleeping in a park. Sarah nodded, maintaining her character. "Will they keep us here long?" "Nah, they'll run us through court in the morning. Just pray we don't get Harrison. That man." Tom's voice trailed off, and Sarah saw genuine fear in his eyes. Throughout the night, Sarah listened to the others sharing their stories about Judge Harrison. One man had been sentenced to 30 days for having an open container of juice that the judge insisted was alcohol. A woman had received community service for sitting on a private building steps during a rainstorm. The holding cell was cold, and the thin blankets they were given smelled of industrial detergent. Sarah didn't have to fake her exhaustion or discomfort. 3 weeks of street life had taken their toll. But beneath her disheveled appearance, her mind was sharp, memorizing every detail of how the system processed its most vulnerable defendants. Morning came with harsh fluorescent lights and stale coffee in paper cups. The court officers herded them into a line, their ankles shackled with chains that clinked against the floor tiles. Sarah felt a surge of anger at this dehumanizing treatment, but kept her eyes down, shoulders slumped. As they shuffled into the courthouse, Sarah heard snippets of conversation between the court officers. "Harrison's on the bench today," one said. "This'll be quick. He never wastes time with these cases." In a holding area outside the courtroom, a public defender rushed through the line, spending less than a minute with each defendant. When he reached Sarah, he barely looked up from his stack of files. "Panhandling charge. Plead guilty, get time served and a fine. That's your best option," he said mechanically. Sarah shook her head. "I want to address the judge," she whispered. The public defender finally looked at her, surprise crossing his tired face. "Your funeral," he muttered, making a note in her file. As the bailiff called their cases one by one, Sarah waited patiently. She could hear Judge Harrison's booming voice through the doors, his contempt clear even from a distance. Finally, she heard. "Case number 247, Marie Smith, panhandling in a restricted area." Sarah stood, chains rattling. As she was led into the courtroom, she thought of Grace, Tom, and all the others who had shared their stories with her. She thought of her comfortable office 23 floors above the street, and how distant that life seemed now. Most of all, she thought about justice, and how it was about to be served in a way Judge Harrison never expected. The fluorescent lights of courtroom 304 buzzed overhead as Sarah shuffled forward in her chains. Judge William Harrison sat high on his bench, his silver hair perfectly combed, his black robe pristine. He barely glanced at the case file before him, his lips curling into a familiar sneer. "Another one of our city's professional beggars," Harrison announced to the courtroom, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Ms. Smith, I see you've been gracing our streets with your presence and harassing our hard-working citizens for their money." Sarah kept her head down, but her keen legal mind noted every word, every tone of contempt. The gallery was half full with law students, other defendants, and a few curious onlookers. Perfect witnesses for what was about to unfold. "Your Honor," the public defender began, but Harrison waved him off. "Let me guess," Harrison continued, leading forward. You're going to tell me about your unfortunate circumstances, how society has failed you. How do you just need one more chance? He chuckled, and a few sycophantic court officers joined in. Sarah remained silent, letting the judge dig himself deeper. Look at me when I'm speaking to you, Ms. Smith, Harrison demanded, his voice sharp. Slowly, Sarah raised her head, but maintained her character. The judge's face reddened at what he perceived as defiance. I've seen hundreds like you, Harrison continued. Too lazy to work, expecting handouts, turning our city streets into your personal bedroom. Well, not in my jurisdiction. The public defender tried again. Your Honor, if we could discuss the circumstances. The circumstances? Harrison's voice rose. The circumstances are clear. Miss Smith here thinks she's above the law. Probably spends whatever money she collects on drugs or alcohol. Isn't that right, Miss Smith? Sarah noticed a young law student in the gallery frantically taking notes. Good. More documentation. Do you have anything to say in your defense before I sentence you? Harrison asked, clearly not expecting much of a response. Sarah cleared her throat, her voice still rough from weeks on the street. Yes, Your Honor. I'd like to discuss the constitutional implications of selective enforcement of anti-panhandling ordinances, particularly in light of the Supreme Court's decisions regarding First Amendment-protected speech. The courtroom fell silent. Judge Harrison blinked, his smug expression faltering slightly. Excuse me, he said, genuinely thrown off balance for the first time. Furthermore, Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger, I'd like to address the court's systematic discrimination against homeless defendants, including the violation of equal protection principles under the 14th Amendment. The public defender's mouth had fallen open. Court officers stopped their side conversations. Every eye in the room was now fixed on the disheveled woman in chains. Judge Harrison's face darkened. How dare you come into my courtroom and... Additionally, Sarah pressed on, I'd like to cite Martinez v. City of Los Angeles regarding the criminalization of poverty and the recent federal court decision in Thompson v. State of Oregon about the unconstitutionality of punishing unavoidable consequences of homelessness. Bailiff, Harrison shouted, his face now purple with rage, remove this. And finally, Sarah's voice rose above his, I'd like to discuss your consistent pattern of judicial misconduct, particularly your documented bias against homeless defendants, which violates the Code of Judicial Conduct, specifically Canons 1, 2, and 3. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Harrison slammed his gavel repeatedly. Who you think you are? He demanded. Sarah stood straighter, letting her practiced homeless posture fall away. With deliberate movements, she wiped some of the dirt from her face with her sleeve. Well, Your Honor, she said, her voice now clear and professional. For the past 3 weeks, I've been Marie Smith. But my real name is Sarah Chen, senior partner at Preston & Chen Law Firm, and you just provided an excellent demonstration of the judicial prejudice I've been documenting. The gavel fell from Judge Harrison's hand, clattering on his bench. The law student in the gallery dropped his pen. The public defender sat down heavily in his chair. Sarah looked directly into Judge Harrison's eyes, which were now wide with shock and dawning horror. And I believe, Your Honor, we need to have a serious discussion about the administration of justice in your courtroom. The silence that followed was absolute. In that moment, the balance of power in courtroom 304 shifted completely, and everyone present knew they were witnessing something extraordinary. Chaos erupted in courtroom 304. Judge Harrison's face had turned from purple to ashen gray as he stared at the woman before him. The gallery burst into excited whispers, and several people were already pulling out their phones to record the unprecedented scene. Order. Order in the court. Harrison's voice cracked as he banged his gavel, but the authority he'd wielded so confidently moments ago had evaporated. Sarah reached into her tattered coat and pulled out her bar card, which she kept carefully protected in a plastic sleeve. For the record, Your Honor, my bar number is 45,892. I'm sure your clerk can verify my credentials. The clerk, wide-eyed, was already frantically typing into her computer. After a moment, she looked up and nodded shakily. She's telling the truth, Your Honor. Miss Chen is a registered attorney with an active license. This is highly irregular, Harrison sputtered. shuffling papers on his bench. "This is contempt of court. You've made a mockery of." "No, Your Honor," Sarah interrupted, her voice steady. "You've made a mockery of justice. For the past 3 weeks, I've lived on the streets. I've documented every case you presided over involving homeless defendants. I've witnessed firsthand how you treat the most vulnerable members of our society." The public defender had recovered enough to stand. "Your Honor, given these extraordinary circumstances, I move for an immediate recess." "Granted," Harrison said quickly, clearly desperate for a moment to regroup. "Before we recess," Sarah announced, "I'd like to introduce some observers who've been watching these proceedings." She turned to the gallery and nodded. From different corners of the courtroom, 3 well-dressed individuals stood up. "Martin Reynolds, State Bar Association Ethics Committee," said the first. "Diana Martinez, Department of Justice Civil Rights Division," said the second. "James Tucker, Judicial Conduct Review Board," said the third. Judge Harrison gripped his bench so hard his knuckles turned white. The courtroom erupted again, and this time his gavel couldn't restore order. "We've been monitoring your courtroom for the past week, Your Honor," Sarah explained. "But I've been gathering evidence for much longer. Would you like to hear some statistics?" Without waiting for a response, she continued. "In the past year, you've sentenced homeless defendants to an average of 30% longer jail terms than housed defendants for identical offenses. You've denied bail to homeless defendants 85% of the time, compared to 15% for others. And your comments from the bench." She pulled out her worn notebook. "I have documented over 200 instances of discriminatory and prejudicial remarks." The Judicial Conduct Observer was taking rapid notes. Judge Harrison's hands were visibly shaking. "This is all highly improper," he managed to say. "You've engaged in deception." "Actually, Your Honor," Sarah countered, "everything I've done is protected under legal precedent for investigative public interest work. The State Bar Ethics Committee has already reviewed and approved my methods." Martin Reynolds from the Bar Association nodded in confirmation. "Furthermore," Sarah continued, "I have sworn statements from 57 defendants who appeared in your court over the past year. I have video evidence, transcript analysis, and statistical data showing a clear pattern of discriminatory behavior." She turned to address the entire courtroom, but most importantly, "I have experienced firsthand the dehumanizing treatment that thousands of homeless individuals face in our justice system. I've slept on concrete, then ignored by passersby, and felt the sting of prejudice from those sworn to uphold justice." Judge Harrison's face had gone from ashen to almost green. "This session is in recess," he announced weakly, standing on shaky legs. "One moment, Your Honor," the DOJ representative called out. "We'll need you to remain for some preliminary questions." As court officers began clearing the gallery, Sarah noticed Grace and Tom being led in chains through a side door. She called out to the bailiff. "Those defendants are witnesses in an ongoing federal investigation. They need to be released immediately." The bailiff looked uncertainly at Judge Harrison, who could only nod numbly. As Sarah watched her friends being unchained, she felt the weight of the past 3 weeks lifting from her shoulders. Her disguise had served its purpose, but the real work, transforming a broken system, was just beginning. The last thing she saw before being let out was Judge Harrison slumping in his chair, his carefully constructed world of power and prejudice crumbling around him. The conference room at the Department of Justice building buzzed with tension as Sarah Chen, now back in her familiar business attire, laid out 3 months of carefully collected evidence. Her notebook, video recordings, statistical analysis, and witness statements covered the large oak table. "Over these past weeks, I've documented 127 cases in Judge Harrison's court," Sarah explained to the assembled group of investigators, Bar Association representatives, and Justice Department officials. But the story goes much deeper than just numbers. She opened her laptop and played a series of video clips showing Harrison's behavior in court. The footage, secretly recorded by the law students she had carefully positioned in the gallery, showed a clear pattern of abuse. "Notice how he speaks to homeless defendants," Sarah pointed out. "The sneers, the mockery, the assumptions about drug use without evidence. Compare that to how he treats other defendants in similar cases." Diana Martinez from the DOJ leaned forward, studying the transcripts. This is extraordinary work, Ms. Chen. But what made you take such an extreme approach? Sarah pulled out a photograph of Grace, the elderly woman who had first helped her on the streets. Traditional investigations failed because people like Grace were too afraid to come forward. The system had beaten them down so thoroughly that they'd lost faith in legal remedies. She played another recording, this time of Harrison sentencing a homeless veteran to 30 days in jail for sleeping in a park. The judge's words were particularly cruel. People like you are a stain on this city. Maybe a month behind bars will motivate you to become a productive member of society. We gathered testimonies from over 50 former defendants, Sarah continued, passing out thick folders. Each case shows the same pattern of discrimination, humiliation, and excessive punishment. The statistical analysis was particularly damning. Sarah had worked with a data analyst to compare Harrison's sentencing patterns with other judges in the district. The disparities were impossible to ignore. Homeless defendants in Harrison's court received sentences averaging 40% longer than in other courtrooms, she explained, pointing to a graph. And his denial of alternative sentencing options for homeless individuals is nearly absolute, 95%, compared to the district average of 30%. James Tucker from the Judicial Conduct Review Board shook his head in disbelief as he reviewed the documents. The depth of this misconduct, it's unprecedented. Sarah then revealed her most powerful evidence, her own detailed journal from her time on the streets. This isn't just about legal violations, she said, her voice softening. It's about human dignity. She read from her journal. Day 12. Watched a young mother being sentenced for trespassing. She had taken shelter in a parking garage during a rainstorm with her 6-year-old son. Judge Harrison called her an unfit mother and threatened to call child services. The fear in her eyes. The room fell silent as Sarah continued sharing stories. Each entry painted a picture not just of judicial misconduct, but of a systemic failure to protect society's most vulnerable members. What's remarkable, Martin Reynolds from the Bar Association noted, is how you maintained your legal objectivity while gathering such emotionally charged evidence. Sarah opened a final folder containing medical records. These show the impact of Harrison's harsh sentences. People with chronic health conditions denied medical treatment while in jail. Mental health patients forced off their medications. The ripple effects of his prejudice have literally cost lives. The evidence was irrefutable. Photos, videos, audio recordings, statistical analysis, medical records, witness statements, and Sarah's first-hand accounts formed a comprehensive picture of judicial abuse that couldn't be ignored or explained away. And here's the most disturbing pattern, Sarah said, pulling up a timeline on her laptop. The harsher his sentences became, the more praise he received from certain political circles. He was being rewarded for this behavior. As the officials began discussing next steps, Sarah received a text message from Grace. The shelter's buzzing with news about what you did. People are finally feeling hope. Sarah smiled slightly, then turned back to the task at hand. This evidence isn't just about removing one prejudiced judge, she concluded. It's about changing how our justice system treats its most vulnerable citizens. Harrison is a symptom of a larger problem, and now we have the proof to address it. The DOJ representatives nodded gravely. The case against Judge Harrison was just the beginning of a much larger fight for justice reform. The media storm hit like a hurricane. Within days of Sarah Chen's revelation, news outlets across the country picked up the story. Headlines screamed, "Attorney goes undercover to expose corrupt judge," and "Homeless J. Judge Harrison's office had gone dark." He hadn't appeared in court since the revelation, calling in sick through his attorney, but the wheels of justice were turning swiftly against him. The Judicial Conduct Committee has suspended Judge Harrison pending a full investigation, announced the committee chairperson at a packed press conference. The evidence presented by Ms. Chen raises serious concerns about judicial misconduct. At Preston and Chen law firm, Sarah faced her own challenges. Her senior partners called an emergency meeting in the mahogany-lined conference room on the top floor. "What you did was incredibly risky," said Thomas Preston, the firm's founding partner. "You could have been disbarred. The firm could have been liable. You should have consulted us." Sarah sat straight in her chair, unflinching. "Would you have approved the investigation?" The silence that followed was answer enough. "This isn't just about Harrison," Sarah continued. Our entire legal system needs reform, and now we have a chance to lead that change. The media attention brought unexpected consequences. Some clients threatened to leave the firm, uncomfortable with Sarah's methods. Others, impressed by her commitment to justice, sought them out specifically. But the most significant impact was happening on the streets. Grace and Tom had become unofficial spokespersons for the homeless community, sharing their stories with investigators and reporters. She lived with us, suffered with us. Grace told a local news station. She didn't just study our problems, she experienced them. That's why we trust her. Not everyone supported Sarah's methods. Legal blogs and commentary shows debated the ethics of her undercover operation. Some critics accused her of manipulating the system, while others questioned her motives. This kind of vigilante justice undermines the legal process, argued a prominent legal commentator. There are proper channels for addressing judicial misconduct. Sarah addressed these criticisms at a bar association meeting. The proper channels failed. They failed for years. Sometimes, justice requires extraordinary measures. The investigation expanded beyond Harrison. Other judges found themselves under scrutiny for their treatment of homeless defendants. Court-watching programs sprang up in cities across the country, inspired by Sarah's methods. At her office, Sarah received hundreds of letters from homeless individuals sharing their stories of judicial abuse. Each one strengthened her resolve to push for systemic change. The personal cost was significant. Sarah's health had suffered from her weeks on the streets. Her doctor diagnosed her with respiratory issues from exposure to the elements. She had lost weight, and sometimes still woke up disoriented, reaching for a blanket that wasn't there. "You need to take care of yourself," Lisa, her sister, insisted during a rare quiet dinner together. "You can't help others if you burn out." But Sarah was already planning her next moves. She had started drafting legislation to reform how courts handle cases involving homeless defendants. Her firm, initially hesitant, now backed her efforts with their considerable resources. Judge Harrison finally broke his silence through his attorney. "While I maintained that my judicial decisions were based on law rather than bias, I acknowledged that some of my comments and actions may have been inappropriate." The statement rang hollow against the mountain of evidence Sarah had collected. The Judicial Commission's preliminary findings were damning. Harrison's career was effectively over. Yet Sarah found no joy in his downfall. "This was never about one judge," she explained to her colleagues. "It's about changing a system that treats poverty as a crime." The consequences continued to ripple outward. Law schools began incorporating modules on homeless justice into their ethics courses. Several cities revised their anti-panhandling ordinances. Public defenders received additional resources for cases involving homeless clients. Late one evening, as Sarah worked in her office, Tom appeared at her door. He was clean-shaven now, wearing a domated suit, ready to testify at the Judicial Commission's hearings. "You changed everything," he said simply. "Not just for me, but for everyone out there who thought they didn't have a voice." Sarah looked out her window at the city below, remembering the cold nights and hard concrete. "We're just getting started," she replied. "The real work is still ahead." The sun was setting over the city, casting long shadows across the streets where she had once slept. But now, those shadows held the promise of change rather than the threat of darkness. 6 months after Sarah Chen's undercover investigation shook the judicial system, the landscape of homeless justice in the city had transformed dramatically. The old courthouse, where Judge Harrison once presided, now housed something unprecedented: the Center for Equal Justice, a legal clinic dedicated to serving the homeless community. Sarah stood in what used to be Harrison's courtroom, now converted into a welcoming consultation space. Gone were the imposing bench and restrictive barriers. Instead, comfortable chairs and round tables created an environment of equality and dignity. "We helped over 300 clients in our first month," Sarah explained to a group of law students who had volunteered at the clinic. Among them was the same student who had taken detailed notes during her confrontation with Harrison. "Remember when you first met me?" Grace asked Sarah during their lunch break. "Who would have thought we'd end up here?" The changes extended far beyond the clinic. The city council had passed the Dignity and Justice Act, legislation that Sarah had helped draft. The new law mandated fair treatment of homeless defendants, required judges to consider alternative sentencing options, and provided resources for legal representation. Tom, who had received treatment for his mental health issues through the clinic's advocacy, now worked as a part-time consultant for the center. He had helped develop a mobile app that homeless individuals could use to document their interactions with law enforcement and the courts. The app has already gathered evidence for 3 civil rights cases, Tom reported proudly during a staff meeting. Nobody can ignore us anymore. The judicial system itself underwent significant reforms. New training programs, developed with input from former homeless individuals, became mandatory for judges and court officers. Courtroom observers, inspired by Sarah's methods, regularly monitored proceedings to ensure fair treatment. Harrison's replacement, Judge Maria Rodriguez, took a radically different approach to cases involving homeless defendants. Before making any decision, she explained to her colleagues, "I ask myself, am I addressing the cause or just punishing the symptom?" Sarah's law firm had also evolved. Preston and Chen now required all attorneys to spend time volunteering at the clinic, experiencing firsthand the challenges faced by homeless clients. The program had transformed the firm's culture, making social justice a cornerstone of their practice. "You've created a model that other cities are following," Thomas Preston admitted to Sarah during a partners meeting. "Sometimes the riskiest decisions turn out to be the wisest." The impact reached beyond the legal system. Local businesses, once quick to call police on homeless individuals, now participated in job training programs. Shelters worked closely with the clinic to provide comprehensive support services. One morning, Sarah arrived at the clinic to find a familiar face waiting outside. It was a young mother she had met during her time on the streets, the one who had been threatened with losing her child for seeking shelter from the rain. "I heard you were here," the woman said, her eyes bright with tears. "I wanted you to know. I've got a job now, an apartment. My son is doing great in school. None of this would have happened if you hadn't exposed the truth." The national media have continued to follow the story. A documentary team was filming the clinic's work, showcasing how one person's courage could spark systemic change. Law schools across the country studied the case as an example of innovative justice reform. Sarah's personal transformation was profound. The experience had changed not just how she practiced law, but how she viewed humanity itself. Her office wall now displayed a simple photograph, the corner where she had first slept rough, a reminder of why she fought for change. Late one evening, as Sarah prepared to leave the clinic, she found Grace sitting quietly in the consultation area. "Sometimes I still can't believe it," Grace said softly. "People walk in here scared, expecting to be treated like garbage. Instead, they find respect, help, hope." Sarah looked around the room, remembering the harsh voice that once filled it with contempt. Now it echoed with different sounds, quiet conversations, gentle laughter, the rustle of paperwork that meant someone was getting a second chance. "This is what justice should look like," Sarah replied. "Not a weapon to punish poverty, but a tool to lift people up." Outside, the city lights twinkled against the darkening sky. On the streets where Sarah had once gathered evidence of injustice, people now gathered hope for a better tomorrow. The change she had fought for wasn't just in the system, it was in the hearts and minds of everyone it touched.